Castle of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse. Part remake of the classic Genesis game, part throwback to the old Disney games of the 90s. But is it just riding the nostalgia wave, or is it a legitimately good game in its own right? Well, first of all, what's going on in Castle of Illusion? One day, Mickey Mouse and his,
devoted sweetheart,
Minnie Mouse, are headed out to the woods for a picnic. Apparently these two are incredibly self-centered since they believe that as long as they're happy, everyone else is happy.
Mickey and Minnie were so happy that they were certain everyone must feel the same.
Suddenly, the evil witch Miserable appears and kidnaps Minnie. She's jealous of her beauty, you see, and thus Mickey's quest begins. He must save Minnie from having her beauty drained and thus making her evil. Wait, what? I'm sorry, when did this game come out again? 2013? Okay, yeah, no, I get it, it makes sense. Yeah, no, made a lot of progress for women since then. Just a product of the times. Something I love about this game's story is that it's presented as a play, even though it's one of the most basic kinds of video game stories. It's literally just, Mickey must find the 7 Chaos Emeralds or Rainbow Gems or whatever. He must find the 7 things and then fight the boss. I like to imagine that all the time when you fall into pits or get a game over or whatever, that's all part of the play too. But speaking of falling into pits and such, let's talk about the gameplay. It's not that great. It just seems to miss a lot of these basic things that a better game would just know. Not even like a really great game, it just sort of lacks the flow that most platformers would have. There's no momentum to the jumps, you stop the moment that you let go of the button, and all the platforming challenges seem really formulaic. There are hidden items to be found in every level, and at first I thought you might have to do some complex platforming or something tricky to try and get to them. But I quickly realized that if there was something that I could see and I couldn't reach, I just had to find the moving platform that would take me right to it. Something that makes a return from pretty much every Disney game in the 90s is the ability to throw projectiles. But it's amazing how useless this ability is. There's a few areas where they force you to use it, where you can use it to find a minor collectible. But it's incredibly underutilized and never required, because you have to pick up ammo and you can't assume that you're going to have it. And that leaves only the jumping. And this game adds a new thing from the classic, where you can move around in 3D and do some platforming. But this disables your throwing ability, which means all you can do is platforming. The level design is pretty bland, but at the very least they look nice. However, they have that problem that a lot of 2.5D games have, where the backgrounds are so busy that they look just like the parts that you can actually jump on, but they're part of the background, and there's no real good indication of that. And that's just the 2D sections. When you go into the 3D sections, sometimes the games give you the absolute worst possible camera angles. The worst offender of this is definitely the final boss. It took me 3 hours to beat this game, and one of those hours was just me fighting the final boss. Not because it's a hard boss, but because when you fight the boss, it throws you into this terrible camera angle that makes it so you can't see the threads. But the biggest crime this game commits is that it just doesn't have the flow of a normal platforming game. Areas have traps that you'd think would trigger at just a slightly different time, and there's areas where Mickey is forced into a run, and yet there'll be moving platforms that might not be in the right place for these sections. It completely ruins the flow and forces you to come to a stop in what should be a very visceral moment where you're always moving. The music is pretty great though. The themes for the levels, however, are incredibly generic. They're not your usual grass, fire, ice, desert worlds you see in a lot of other platformers, but rather they're the most cliché of fantasy worlds that you see in children's books and the like. You have a magic forest, you have a clockwork area, and all the enemies you fight are just as cliché. You fight a jack-in-the-box in the toy area, in the forest area you fight a tree. What's worse is the strategy for every single boss, up to and including the final boss, is just waiting until they expose their weak spot and then jumping on their head. The game is severely lacking a creative pulse, which is really bizarre because of the rich history Disney has going for it. And speaking of using that Disney history, the villain, Miserable, is pretty much an exact copy of the Queen from Snow White. I don't understand why, if they were just going to reuse these designs, they didn't do that for more characters and at least get some brand recognition that way. I'd much rather be fighting well-known Disney characters for these bosses as opposed to just generic fantasy creatures. Now, the last issue I want to talk about is the difficulty. I was able to breeze through the game pretty quickly. However, it's still a surprisingly unforgiving game. You only start a level with half your health, and you have a pretty limited pool of lives as well. Despite this, the game has a very condescendingly young story. It definitely has a feel that's aimed at very young people. To test this theory, I had my niece play it, and she did run into quite a few issues with it. The weird thing is, this game clearly fits into the stereotype that Mickey Mouse is for very little kids. Yet the difficulty of the game seems far more aimed at what the skill level of the kids who played the game back in the 90s would have right now. All in all, this game isn't terrible, but there are a lot better options for you out there. It doesn't really do anything with the brand it draws from. It's kind of condescending if you're older and actually want to play it. And it's really just a generic platformer with some kind of awkward mechanics and not that great level design. It's not terrible by any means, it's functional. Though playing through it with my niece, I did notice some more issues, like getting caught on some geometry and such. But overall, I have a very hard time recommending it, though it might be fun if you're older and want to play it with a younger sibling or your kids or something like that. Now there is one last thing to talk about with this game, because not only did it come with the brand new remastered game, but it came with the classic Genesis version as well. And this game has issues all to its own. The biggest one for me was the absolutely baffling decision to make it so that jumping on enemies doesn't hurt them. You had to press the jump button again to do a sort of stomp move. The thing is, it's completely unnecessary because this stomp move doesn't affect Mickey's movement at all, so it's just an extra button press and makes it more likely for you to be blindsided by enemies. Throw in some very beginner mistakes in the level design, like putting a health pickup or an extra life on a platform but then having no way to get back onto the main path of the level and being forced to jump into a pit. So overall, both of these games are pretty flawed, but I guess there's some enjoyment to be had, just not by everybody. Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to see more videos like this, you can check out the last review, Batman Arkham City. And hey, if you like this video, subscribe to Tentacle Touch You, it really helps him out.